The emergency transmission reached every inhabited star system at exactly the same moment. It interrupted elections, halted freight convoys, silenced universities, froze orbital stock exchanges, and even cut through military command channels that had never been breached in the 800 years since the Galactic Council had united the civilized species. For the first time in generations, every world looked toward the same signal, expecting another routine announcement from politicians who had spent centuries convincing the galaxy that war had become an obsolete relic. Instead, the screen showed the burning remains of 3 council capitals, each erased in less than 6 hours by an enemy that had never issued demands, never opened negotiations, and never responded to a single diplomatic message. Supreme Chancellor Varesh stood before the assembly with exhaustion carved into every movement. Around him floated shattered sensor recordings of entire planetary defense fleets disappearing into impossible clouds of dark geometric vessels that moved without recognizable engines, emitted no communications, and ignored every known law of interstellar combat. Fleet after fleet had been destroyed before commanders even understood what they were fighting. The Council's greatest admirals had become names on casualty lists, and worlds once believed untouchable now existed only as expanding rings of debris. Yet despite the catastrophe unfolding across the frontier, the Chancellor delivered the same order the Council had repeated for centuries. No member civilization will initiate military escalation. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted across translation channels, while holographic voting platforms flashed in desperate disagreement. Some demanded immediate retaliation. Others argued that the unidentified civilization might still be reasoned with. Entire alliances fractured in minutes as fear replaced diplomacy. Every government wanted someone else to fire the first shot, because 8 centuries of enforced peace had transformed caution into doctrine and doctrine into religion. Only one delegation remained silent. Humanity's representatives simply listened. No protests, no negotiations, no speeches. When the Chancellor finally turned toward Earth's delegation and demanded confirmation that humanity would comply with the peace accord, Ambassador Elena Ward rose slowly from her seat. She neither argued nor pleaded. Her expression carried neither fear nor anger, only a strange disappointment, as though the conversation had happened long before anyone else realized it had begun. The Council believes peace survives because everyone agrees to protect it, she said quietly. Humanity learned a different lesson. Before anyone could ask what she meant, every transmission from Earth vanished. Not degraded, not jammed, gone. Military satellites reported that every human communication relay, every naval command frequency, every civilian quantum network had disconnected simultaneously with impossible precision. 1 second, humanity occupied thousands of communication channels across known space. The next, it had become the only civilization that could no longer be contacted. Confusion spread faster than panic. Council intelligence assumed a catastrophic cyber attack. Economic analysts predicted internal collapse. Several delegates openly celebrated what they believed was humanity's surrender. Then the long-range observatories began reporting impossible readings. Beyond the mapped frontier, where only automated telescopes watched the darkness between galaxies, thousands of dormant gravitational signatures awakened together. Massive objects, each hidden for centuries inside dead systems abandoned long before the peace accord existed, ignited one after another like distant stars suddenly remembering how to burn. No registry recognized them. No construction records existed. No civilization claimed ownership. The Council's oldest archives contained scattered references to similar anomalies, dismissed for generations as navigation errors made during the earliest expansion era. Within minutes, the number of signatures climbed from dozens to hundreds. Then hundreds became thousands. Entire constellations seemed to come alive. Deep beneath the Council Intelligence Directorate, analysts struggled to understand why every hidden object was moving toward the invasion corridor instead of away from it. Their predictive models crashed repeatedly as more unknown vessels emerged from regions believed completely empty. Each carried human identification codes that had never appeared in any military database. Someone whispered the phrase first: the Shadow Fleet. Nobody knew where the name had come from. Nobody knew whether it was rumor or classified history. But suddenly, every frightened officer was repeating it. When the first visual feed finally resolved, the silence inside the council chamber became absolute. There was no grand flagship, no ceremonial armada. Instead, countless human warships appeared from the darkness, each radically different from the next, bearing conflicting designs, different hull philosophies, unfamiliar weapons, and even incompatible propulsion systems, as though every fleet had been built by civilizations that had never met each other. Nothing about them followed military logic. Nothing about them resembled the Earth fleets recorded under the Peace Accord. And perhaps most terrifying of all, they weren't flying toward Earth. They were flying away from it. Seconds later, one final encrypted message reached every surviving world before humanity disappeared once again. Peace has never been protected by those who believed it was permanent. Then every shadow fleet accelerated into the darkness, toward an enemy they seemed to have been expecting for a very, very long time. For the next 17 hours, the galaxy watched humanity do absolutely nothing. That, more than anything else, unsettled the Galactic Council. The shadow fleets continued advancing in complete silence, never responding to hails, never broadcasting commands, never issuing threats toward the unidentified invaders. They crossed hundreds of light years in perfectly disciplined formations, yet every fleet moved differently. Some traveled in dense defensive clusters. Others stretched across millions of kilometers like migrating constellations. Several appeared to change formations every few minutes without any visible communication between ships. Military analysts expected confusion from an uncoordinated force. Instead, they found a level of precision they could neither explain nor replicate. Council intelligence assigned Director Kalen Voss to uncover the truth. Voss had spent 38 years dismantling conspiracies across the civilized galaxy. He had exposed hidden governments, uncovered illegal weapons programs, and once prevented an entire interstellar conflict simply by proving that both sides had been manipulated by fabricated intelligence. He trusted evidence above instinct. But nothing about humanity's disappearance fit evidence. Earth's known navy consisted of 212 registered warships. The shadow fleets already numbered more than 4,000. Every database insisted those ships did not exist. Every sensor insisted they did. Something was terribly wrong. His team began digging through 8 centuries of archived council inspections, expecting to discover forged reports or corrupt officials. Instead, they found something even stranger. Humanity had never violated a single inspection. Every registered vessel had been exactly where it was supposed to be. Every weapon's inventory matched official declarations. Every military audit had passed without objection. It was almost too perfect. They didn't hide a fleet, one analyst murmured. They hid the definition of a fleet. The room fell silent. The statement sounded absurd. Then the reports began arriving. Across hundreds of forgotten systems, abandoned mining colonies that had supposedly closed centuries ago suddenly powered back to life. Automated repair docks emerged from beneath asteroid surfaces. Ancient cargo stations unfolded like mechanical flowers awakening after a long winter. Entire moons, believed geologically dead, split apart to reveal enormous shipyards concealed beneath artificial crusts. None of them had been built recently. Radiometric dating estimated some structures were over 400 years old. Humanity had not prepared after the invasion began. They had prepared before anyone imagined such an invasion was possible. Even that realization raised another question. Prepared for whom? The invaders still refused every attempt at communication. They never broadcast threats, never celebrated victories, never demanded surrender. They simply advanced. Each conquered system followed the same terrifying pattern. Communication vanished first, then navigation, Then orbital logistics. Defense satellites shut down without visible attack. Fleet command structures collapsed into confusion. Only after an entire civilization had become blind, isolated, and unable to coordinate did the enemy arrive to finish the destruction. Not once had they launched a reckless frontal assault. Not once had they wasted resources. They dismantled civilizations the way an engineer dismantled a machine. Methodically, efficiently, without emotion. Council fleets continued responding exactly as centuries of doctrine required. Large formations, centralized command, unified strategy. Each one died faster than the last. Supreme Commander Rel's 3rd Expeditionary Armada entered the Hespera corridor with nearly 900 capital ships. Observers expected the largest battle in recorded history. Instead, the battle never happened. Before firing a single weapon, Rel lost contact with 6 logistics groups. Moments later, navigation arrays began producing contradictory coordinates. Entire squadrons accidentally collided while attempting emergency repositioning. Targeting networks started identifying friendly vessels as unknown contacts. Within 26 minutes, the largest armada ever assembled had become thousands of isolated ships fighting entirely different battles without realizing it. The invaders destroyed them almost effortlessly. Director Voss replayed the recordings again and again. The enemy did not overpower superior numbers. They erased organization. Everything depended on centralized doctrine. Destroy the doctrine. Victory became inevitable. His thoughts drifted toward humanity. Their shadow fleets showed no signs of centralized command whatsoever. Each fleet behaved like an independent civilization. Different tactics, different formations, different communication protocols. Some even used incompatible weapon systems. Military theory declared such diversity impossible. Humanity seemed to embrace it. What if? Voss whispered. He never finished the sentence. Because another report arrived. The first Shadow Fleet had reached the invasion frontier. Every observer expected humanity to launch the counterattack that would justify centuries of secret preparation. Instead, the human ships opened enormous cargo bays. Not missile silos, not fighter hangars, cargo bays. Millions of evacuation craft poured into nearby systems. Rather than engaging the enemy, humanity began rescuing civilians from worlds the Council had already abandoned. Entire alien populations boarded human transports while the Shadow Fleet ignored the advancing invasion completely. Council media reacted instantly. Cowards. Traitors, warmongers pretending to be heroes. Political commentators accused humanity of sacrificing military opportunity for public relations. Several council delegates demanded immediate sanctions once the crisis ended. Even military officers began questioning whether humanity had spent centuries preparing only to run away. Director Voss wasn't convinced. He watched one evacuation fleet alter course 3 separate times despite having perfectly safe escape routes. At first, the movements looked inefficient. Then another fleet mirrored the pattern. Then another. They weren't escaping randomly. They were deliberately leaving behind narrow corridors of empty space. Hours later, long-range surveillance confirmed the invaders followed those exact corridors without deviation. Voss leaned closer to the tactical display. Every evacuation, every abandoned outpost, every human withdrawal, every seemingly wasted maneuver was quietly shaping the enemy's direction of travel. The realization sent a chill through the command center. Humanity wasn't retreating. Humanity was hurting. Toward what? No one could yet answer. Then the oldest observatory in the Council transmitted an alert no one had expected. Far beyond the frontier, hidden inside a dead stellar cluster that had contained no life for over 1,000 years, another Shadow Fleet awakened. Unlike the others, it never changed course. It simply waited, as if it already knew exactly where the enemy would eventually arrive. The Council's official narrative lasted exactly 43 hours before reality shattered it. Humanity was not running. Humanity was positioning. Director Kalen Voss stood alone inside the strategic observation chamber as hundreds of holographic star maps floated around him. Every known movement made by the shadow fleets had been reconstructed from sensor logs gathered across the frontier. Thousands of color trajectories crisscrossed the projection, each representing a different human task force. At first glance, the movements looked chaotic. No two fleets followed identical doctrines. No two admirals appeared to prioritize the same objectives. Several formations even abandoned advantageous positions that every military academy in the galaxy would have defended without hesitation. It looked inefficient until the overlays disappeared. One by one, Voss removed every human fleet from the display. Only the enemy's movements remained. The room became eerily quiet. The invasion corridor, once sprawling across nearly 300 star systems, had narrowed. Not because the invaders had changed, because humanity had quietly convinced them to. Every evacuation, every abandoned station, every destroyed supply depot, every unexplained withdrawal had subtly influenced the enemy's decisions. Like water flowing through invisible channels, the invaders had been guided toward a destination they believed they had chosen themselves. Voss felt something cold settle in his stomach. Predators chased. Humans directed the chase. That distinction changed everything. His assistant finally broke the silence. They're treating the invasion like terrain. No one answered, because everyone understood what that meant. For 8 centuries, every advanced civilization had believed battlefields existed only where armies met. Humanity seemed to believe battlefields could be designed years before anyone arrived. Across the frontier, the invaders continued their relentless advance. Entire systems disappeared from Council control every few hours. The casualty reports became too large for ordinary broadcasts. Millions became billions. Governments collapsed under refugee waves. Trade networks ceased to exist. Entire species prepared evacuation plans for their homeworlds. Fear became the galaxy's common language. Yet despite the unimaginable destruction, humanity still refused to launch a decisive engagement. The shadow fleets remained just beyond striking distance. Always watching, always moving, never committing. Council delegates grew increasingly furious. They're waiting for us to die. They're preserving their own strength. They never intended to save anyone. Political pressure mounted against Earth faster than the invasion itself. Several member civilizations proposed stripping humanity of permanent council membership. Others demanded that surviving fleets seize human shipyards before more illegal warships could emerge. Even those rescued aboard human transports began questioning their mysterious protectors. A frightened civilian finally asked one of the evacuation officers the question spreading throughout the galaxy. Why won't your fleets fight? The officer looked toward the distant stars before answering. They already are. The reply made no sense. Not then. Far beyond the refugee convoys, inside one of the countless shadow fleets, Admiral Isaac Mercer watched hundreds of tactical projections rotate across the bridge of the Resolute Dawn. Unlike every Council flagship ever built, his command center contained no grand central display. Instead, dozens of independent tactical stations surrounded the bridge, each analyzing the battle differently. One team studied logistics. Another ignored logistics entirely and modeled only psychology. A third focused exclusively on stellar geography. Several departments openly disagreed with one another. Arguments filled the bridge almost constantly. No officer seemed embarrassed by it. Quite the opposite. Mercer encouraged disagreement. Whenever 2 analysts reached identical conclusions, he reassigned one of them. Every assumption had to be challenged before it became dangerous. A young lieutenant finally approached. "Sir, Fleet Echo recommends reinforcing the Harlan Expanse." Mercer barely glanced up. "And Fleet Orion? They recommend abandoning it immediately. And Fleet Bastion? They recommend destroying it ourselves." Mercer smiled. "Excellent." The lieutenant hesitated. "Which recommendation do we follow?" "None." The bridge officers continued working without surprise. Apparently, this was normal. Mercer walked toward the navigation display and studied dozens of possible futures generated by independent prediction systems. Every model disagreed. Good. Agreement created blind spots. Certainty created patterns. Patterns got people killed. Finally, he issued a single order. Create a fourth option. No one questioned him. Within seconds, every department abandoned its previous conclusions and began inventing entirely new strategies. There was no frustration, only excitement. If an enemy could predict your next move, then your next move was already wrong. Thousands of light years away, the unidentified invaders noticed something unusual. For the first time since entering Council territory, they slowed. Not significantly, barely enough for automated sensors to detect. But they had noticed something. Capture telemetry revealed enemy reconnaissance vessels lingering longer around abandoned systems. Their formations became denser. Advanced groups began double-checking navigation routes they had previously crossed without hesitation. The invaders were growing cautious. Humanity had succeeded in making them think. That alone was unprecedented. No civilization had ever forced the mysterious enemy to hesitate. Director Voss replayed the data dozens of times before speaking quietly. They found something. What? I don't know. But whatever they found, they don't understand it. The room grew silent once again. The invaders had dismantled every opponent with mechanical confidence. Now, they were uncertain. Elsewhere, inside the dead stellar cluster first identified 2 days earlier, another secret finally awakened. The waiting Shadow fleet remained perfectly motionless. It had not launched scouts. It had not responded to communications. Its thousands of ships simply orbited an ancient red dwarf star, whose light barely escaped the surrounding dust clouds. Then, without warning, the star itself disappeared. Not exploded. Not collapsed. Disappeared. Space folded inward around it like invisible hands closing over a candle flame. Sensors across the cluster immediately went blind. Every observation satellite lost contact simultaneously. By the time emergency probes restored visual feeds several minutes later, the star had returned. So had the fleet, as though nothing had happened. Except every human vessel now faced the exact direction from which the invasion would eventually arrive. Director Voss stared at the report for a long time. The coordinates had never been transmitted. The enemy had never revealed its destination. No mathematical model could have predicted its future path with that degree of precision. Yet somehow, the Shadow Fleet had already taken its battle positions. As if someone, somewhere within humanity's hidden command structure, already knew where the war would truly begin. By the 52nd hour of the invasion, the Galactic Council was no longer governing a civilization. It was managing a collapse. Entire sectors had fallen silent, not because every world had been destroyed, but because no one could tell which worlds were still alive. Quantum relays blinked out in unpredictable patterns. Refugee convoys drifted without escorts because there were no escorts left to assign. Automated factories shut themselves down after losing synchronization with central logistics. Merchant guilds abandoned centuries-old trade routes overnight, flooding safe systems with shortages that spread faster than the invasion itself. Civilization was not dying in one spectacular moment. It was unraveling one connection at a time. The invaders understood something the Council never had. Empires rarely collapse from the outside. They collapsed when every part stopped trusting the others. Inside the Council's emergency command center, Supreme Chancellor Varesh stared at casualty projections that no longer fit on a single display. Every update made the numbers obsolete before analysts finished calculating them. Entire military academies had ceased issuing tactical recommendations because none of their doctrines survived longer than a single engagement against the mysterious enemy. The old rules had not failed. They had become irrelevant. One exhausted strategist finally voiced what everyone feared. We're losing faster every time we organize. The sentence hung over the chamber like a death sentence. No one argued, because every new fleet assembled under centralized command simply presented the invaders with another perfectly ordered system waiting to be dismantled. Meanwhile, humanity remained impossible to understand. The shadow fleets continued scattering across the frontier, never concentrating enough strength to satisfy the Council's desperate calls for a decisive counterattack. To outside observers, the human response appeared increasingly irrational. One fleet abandoned an entire defense line without firing a shot. Another spent valuable hours towing abandoned cargo stations into empty systems instead of reinforcing endangered colonies. A third disappeared completely inside a dense nebula that possessed no strategic value according to every known military database. Commentators called it incompetence. Military historians called it panic. Only director Kalen Voss refused to accept either explanation. He had stopped asking what humanity was doing. Instead, he began asking what humanity wanted the enemy to do. That single change transformed everything. His analysts layered months of astronomical surveys over recent human movements, searching for connections everyone else had ignored. At first, they found nothing. Then one junior researcher accidentally activated an outdated geological archive dating back nearly 500 years. Dozens of forgotten star systems suddenly highlighted themselves across the map, not because they contained colonies, because they contained resources, rare gravitational crystals, ancient neutron remnants, collapsed stellar fragments, dark matter anomalies. Most civilizations had dismissed them as economically worthless after faster technologies emerged centuries earlier. Humanity had quietly purchased mining rights to almost everyone. Not recently. 4 centuries ago. Voss leaned forward. Overlay the shadow fleets. The room obeyed. Silence followed. Every seemingly random human movement revolved around those forgotten systems. Every evacuation route curved around them. Every retreat protected them. Every abandoned battlefield nudged the invaders one step closer to them. The realization stole the air from the room. Humanity wasn't protecting planets. Humanity was protecting infrastructure no one else even remembered existed. But for what purpose? Before anyone could answer, long-range sensors detected the first enemy reconnaissance force entering one of those ancient systems. Nothing happened. No fleets emerged. No hidden weapons activated. The invaders scanned the region for nearly an hour before continuing their advance. Council observers breathed sighs of relief. Apparently, humanity's mysterious preparations had failed. Director Voss didn't celebrate. He noticed something everyone else overlooked. The enemy had stayed exactly 57 minutes. Not 56. Not 58. Exactly 57. Across 3 separate systems, 3 different reconnaissance groups repeated the same pattern. Scan. Wait. Leave. Always 57 minutes. The invaders were measuring something. But what? Far away, aboard the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Mercer received the same intelligence. His executive officer looked puzzled. They're studying the old infrastructure. Mercer nodded. They're confirming assumptions. Should we intervene? No. They'll discover everything. Mercer looked toward the projection of the frontier with unsettling calm. No. They'll discover exactly what we want them to discover. The officer frowned. What if their assumptions are correct? Mercer's smile carried neither arrogance nor comfort. Then we've already lost. No one spoke after that. Because if humanity's entire strategy depended on manipulating an enemy's assumptions, then one correct assumption could destroy centuries of preparation. Elsewhere, buried beneath the fractured surface of an abandoned moon inside the Harlan Expanse, machines older than most civilizations quietly awakened. No alarms sounded. No dramatic lights illuminated enormous chambers. Thousands of autonomous construction systems simply resumed work they had paused generations earlier. Hidden assembly lines extended kilometer after kilometer beneath solid rock. Robotic foundries forged components whose designs existed nowhere in Council records. Deep reactors, untouched for centuries, climbed steadily toward operational output as if they had merely been waiting for someone to arrive. Above the moon, enemy reconnaissance ships completed their scans. Their sensors penetrated several kilometers underground. They detected energy, industrial activity, Construction. Minutes later, encrypted reports raced toward the enemy's main command formations. Human analysts intercepted fragments of the transmission. "They've seen it," one technician whispered. Director Voss expected immediate catastrophe. Instead, the Shadow fleets continued exactly as before. Not one ship altered course. Not one admiral changed formation. It was as though humanity wanted the enemy to know those facilities existed. That possibility terrified him more than any hidden secret ever could. Hours later, the first major enemy armada abandoned the primary invasion corridor. Rather than driving directly toward the Council core, it pivoted almost 90 degrees and accelerated toward the Harlan Expanse. Council commanders celebrated. They've diverted. They've taken the bait. But Mercer, watching the same movement from light years away, did not celebrate. He stood silently beside the navigation display until every bridge officer had finished cheering. Only then did he issue a single command. "Begin Phase 2. No explanation followed. Across the galaxy, dozens of Shadow fleets immediately abandoned positions they had defended for days. Entire sectors were left exposed. Council officials erupted in outrage. Humanity had just opened a direct path toward 15 populated systems. To every observer, it looked like the greatest strategic mistake of the war. Only Director Voss noticed one impossible detail. Every fleet that withdrew left behind exactly the same distance between themselves and the advancing enemy. Not approximately, precisely, as though every retreat had been measured against something invisible. Then another classified report arrived from the Dead Stellar Cluster. The silent fleet waiting beside the ancient red dwarf had finally begun to move. Not toward the invasion, not toward Earth, but toward the Harlan Expanse. For the first time since the war began, two completely independent Shadow fleets were converging on the same destination. And somehow, the enemy had chosen that destination entirely on its own. The Battle of the Harlan Expanse never began. Historians would argue about the wording for centuries, because every military instinct insisted a confrontation of that scale should have produced the largest fleet engagement in recorded history. More than 2,000 enemy vessels had diverted from the primary invasion corridor. Nearly half of humanity's known Shadow fleets were converging from different sectors. Council observers filled every available sensor platform, convinced they were about to witness the war that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Instead, both sides stopped, separated by barely 3 million kilometers of empty space. Two civilizations simply watched one another. The silence lasted almost 19 minutes. No weapons fired. No warnings were issued. No formations advanced. It was as though each side understood that the first move would reveal something neither could afford to expose. Inside the Council's Emergency Command Center, panic replaced anticipation. Why aren't they attacking? Humanity finally has numerical superiority. They'll never get another opportunity like this. Military advisors demanded immediate action. Political leaders begged Earth to seize the initiative. But every transmission toward the Shadow fleets disappeared unanswered. Humanity remained silent. Director Kalen Voss ignored the arguments behind him. His attention rested entirely on the tactical projection. Something was wrong, not with the enemy, with humanity. Every Shadow fleet had arrived from a different direction, using entirely different formations, yet none had positioned themselves for a conventional battle. One fleet faced away from the enemy altogether. Another occupied a nearby asteroid belt instead of the obvious firing lanes. Several formations deliberately blocked one another's lines of attack. To every strategist in the room, the deployment looked catastrophically inefficient. Then Voss remembered Admiral Mercer's bridge. Different departments, different doctrines, different conclusions. Agreement created blind spots. He suddenly realized what he was seeing. The fleets weren't deploying for one battle. They were preparing for dozens of different possibilities simultaneously. Every Shadow fleet expected the others to fight differently. No centralized commander had forced them into a unified doctrine. The realization was interrupted by a priority alert. Long-range sensors inside the Harlan Expanse began detecting energy signatures beneath hundreds of supposedly abandoned worlds. One reactor, then another, then thousands. Ancient mining colonies lit up across the entire region. Dead shipyards awakened beneath asteroid fields. Hidden relay stations emerged from the shadows of shattered moons. Gigantic manufacturing complexes buried beneath planetary crusts activated after centuries of silence. The council chamber erupted into confusion. Those facilities were abandoned. They're impossible. No civilization maintains infrastructure for 400 years. Director Voss quietly answered the room without looking away from the display. Humanity does. The scale became apparent only after deeper scans arrived. The Harlan Expanse wasn't a battlefield. It was a machine. Every forgotten colony, every mining platform, every abandoned refinery, every derelict orbital dock, every gravitational beacon humanity had quietly purchased, repaired, expanded, and concealed over 4 centuries, formed a single interconnected network stretching across nearly 80 star systems. No one had noticed because no one had ever imagined connecting them. Humanity hadn't hidden a fortress. They had hidden an ecosystem. Far below one lifeless moon, reactors reached full capacity for the first time in generations. Entire mountains shifted. Planetary crust opened like enormous mechanical doors. Construction drones flooded into orbit by the millions. Automated fabrication arrays extended from underground caverns larger than cities. Assembly lines that had waited centuries without human supervision suddenly resumed production as though their shift had merely paused yesterday. Council scientists stared in disbelief. They're building ships. Another analyst corrected him. No, they're rebuilding fleets. Damaged shadow vessels entered orbital dry docks without slowing. Armor plates detached automatically. Destroyed weapon systems were replaced within minutes. Entire propulsion sections were exchanged by synchronized swarms of autonomous machines. Ships that should have required months of repairs returned to operational readiness before observers finished recording the process. The enemy noticed. For the first time since entering Council space, their formations changed without human influence. Reconnaissance squadrons accelerated toward the hidden infrastructure. Heavy assault groups broke formation. Long-range weapons powered up. They had finally identified humanity's greatest advantage, or so they believed. Aboard the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Mercer watched the same reports arrive. His communications officer spoke carefully. They found the network. Mercer nodded. They were supposed to. No one on the bridge looked surprised. One lieutenant finally asked the question that had lingered for days. Sir, was Harlan always the objective? Mercer studied the tactical display before answering. No, it became the objective the moment they believed they'd discovered ours. The bridge fell silent. Even veteran officers needed several seconds to understand. Humanity had never planned to lure the enemy into Harlan because it was important. Humanity had made Harlan important because the enemy believed it was. Perception had become strategy. Belief had become terrain. Director Voss reached exactly the same conclusion thousands of light years away. His hands trembled as he replayed every human withdrawal, every evacuation, every abandoned system, every mysterious detour. None of it had protected Harlan. It had convinced the enemy that Harlan mattered. An entire campaign, built around controlling another civilization's assumptions. Then reality shifted again. The first enemy assault wing entered weapons range of the ancient infrastructure. Council observers expected orbital bombardment. Instead, nothing happened. No planetary shields activated. No defensive batteries emerged. The hidden facilities offered no resistance whatsoever. Enemy landing forces descended without opposition. Within hours, they occupied dozens of automated shipyards. Council broadcast declared humanity's greatest secret lost. Political commentators celebrated the end of Earth's deception. If their hidden infrastructure falls, they've lost everything. Director Voss wasn't listening. Because something impossible had just appeared on his private sensor feed. The automated factories the enemy captured were empty, not abandoned. Empty. No personnel, no command centers, no artificial intelligences, no critical manufacturing equipment, only machinery designed to look important. He zoomed out, then farther still. The true logistics network wasn't concentrated around Harlan at all. It extended invisibly across hundreds of surrounding systems, linked by quantum transport corridors hidden inside natural gravitational anomalies. The enemy had captured the shell. The real machine had already moved. His heart raced. The entire Harlan expanse, every dramatic awakening, every spectacular display, had been nothing more than a distraction large enough to occupy an invading civilization. Before he could warn anyone, emergency alerts flooded every council terminal. Not from Harlan, from the opposite side of the frontier, thousands of light years away. While the enemy committed enormous forces to seizing an illusion, another shadow fleet had quietly entered a region the galaxy had forgotten even existed. And for the first time since the war began, humanity was preparing to strike first. The Council did not realize humanity had attacked until 42 systems went dark. Not destroyed, not occupied, simply disconnected. One moment, they appeared on every tactical display, linked by the dense web of quantum communications that held civilization together. The next, they vanished behind an expanding field of gravitational distortion that blinded every long-range sensor attempting to peer inside. No distress calls escaped. No battle recordings reached the Council. It was as though an entire region of the galaxy had been wrapped inside an invisible curtain. Panic spread immediately. Some believed the enemy had unveiled a new weapon. Others feared humanity's diversion at Harlan had failed more catastrophically than anyone imagined. Only Director Kalen Voss noticed something impossible. Every disconnected system belonged to the enemy. Not a single Council world had disappeared. He looked around the command center, where officers shouted over one another while analysts struggled to restore contact with the missing region. "They're isolated," Voss said quietly. No one heard him. He raised his voice. "They're isolated." The room slowly fell silent. Humanity had not attacked cities. Humanity had attacked information. For the first time since the invasion began, the mysterious civilization could no longer coordinate across its own territory. Far beyond the sensor blackout, Admiral Isaac Mercer stood on the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, watching a tactical display that looked nothing like those used by the Galactic Council. Instead of one massive battlefield, hundreds of independent engagements unfolded simultaneously. No central command directed them. No flagship issued universal orders. Every shadow fleet operated as though it were fighting its own private war. Fleet Bastion had abandoned heavy cruisers entirely, relying on fast attack groups that struck supply lines before disappearing into stellar dust clouds. Fleet Orion ignored enemy logistics and instead hunted reconnaissance vessels, systematically blinding isolated formations. Fleet Echo specialized in deception, broadcasting false fleet movements that convinced enemy commanders they faced overwhelming forces where almost nothing existed. Fleet Atlas did something even stranger. It deliberately allowed itself to be discovered. Mercer watched the reports arrive with measured satisfaction. "They're chasing Atlas." His intelligence officer nodded. "Exactly as predicted. And Fleet Atlas? They've already changed course." Mercer allowed himself the smallest smile. "Good." No tactic lasted long enough to become predictable. That had always been the rule. Across the isolated battlefield, the enemy attempted to adapt. Massive command vessels transmitted emergency directives. Strike groups reorganized. Reconnaissance formations expanded. For several minutes, it appeared their legendary efficiency would once again restore order. Then the impossible happened. Every human fleet changed tactics simultaneously. Not together, differently. Fleet Bastion abandoned fast attacks and began direct assaults. Fleet Orion stopped hunting scouts entirely and targeted fuel reserves instead. Fleet Echo ceased broadcasting false signals and disappeared. Fleet Atlas split into 7 independent formations that immediately began fighting each other, or so enemy sensors believed. The invaders responded. Again, 5 minutes later, humanity changed everything again. Director Voss watched intercepted telemetry with growing disbelief. They're rewriting doctrine. His senior analyst frowned. In the middle of combat. No, Voss corrected himself. They're abandoning doctrine. Military history had always followed a simple principle. Discover an effective strategy. Repeat it. Improve it. Humanity seemed to follow the exact opposite philosophy. The moment something worked, they stopped using it. Every successful engagement became obsolete before the enemy finished studying it. Patterns dissolved almost as quickly as they appeared. Prediction became impossible. Inside the enemy's isolated territory, confusion slowly replaced precision. Strike groups arrived to reinforce battles that had already ended. Reconnaissance squadrons searched for fleets that no longer existed. Entire formations pursued false objectives created by tactics humanity had abandoned hours earlier. The invaders were no longer responding to reality. They were responding to history. And history kept changing. Then came the counterattack. Without warning, the mysterious civilization unveiled something the Council had never witnessed before. At the center of the isolated region, one enormous vessel emerged from hyperspace. It dwarfed every known warship. Its surface appeared almost liquid, flowing continuously as impossible geometric structures formed and dissolved across its hull. Sensors struggled to classify it. Every scan returned contradictory dimensions. The ship seemed larger from certain angles than physics allowed. Director Voss stared at the first recovered images. What is that? No one answered, because every intelligence database returned the same result. Unknown. The giant vessel did not fire weapons. Instead, invisible waves expanded outward through the battlefield. Immediately, enemy formations that had struggled to coordinate began moving with terrifying synchronization. Fleets separated by dozens of light years reacted as though sharing one mind. Tactical mistakes vanished. Human feints stopped working. Ambushes failed. Supply convoys were intercepted before leaving hidden routes. One after another, shadow fleets reported mounting losses. Fleet Echo disappeared completely. Fleet Orion lost nearly 40% of its capital ships during a single engagement. Fleet Atlas barely escaped encirclement. For the first time since humanity seized the initiative, they were retreating. Council observers watched the reports in horror. So they can adapt. Director Voss shook his head. No, they're learning. There was a difference. Adapting meant responding. Learning meant remembering. If that colossal command vessel continued analyzing humanity's decentralized warfare, eventually it would predict the very unpredictability that had carried Earth this far. Aboard the Resolute Dawn, the bridge remained remarkably calm despite the deteriorating situation. Casualty reports accumulated. Entire task forces requested reinforcement. Several shadow fleets recommended immediate withdrawal from the isolated region. Mercer read every report before quietly issuing the same response. Denied. His executive officer finally stepped forward. We're losing too much. We expected to. They're adapting faster than projected. Mercer nodded. They are. Then why stay? For several moments, Mercer simply watched the enormous enemy command vessel drifting through the tactical display. It still believes we're trying to win. The officer looked confused. Aren't we? Mercer's eyes never left the projection. No, we're teaching it. Silence settled across the bridge. Not one officer asked another question, because every veteran aboard understood what the younger officers did not. Humanity had spent centuries preparing for an enemy no one believed existed. If they had prepared this long, they had almost certainly prepared for failure too. Then emergency sensors erupted across the bridge. The colossal enemy command vessel had finally done what humanity had been waiting for since the first day of the invasion. It had identified Earth. Within seconds, Every surviving enemy fleet received the same destination. The entire invasion changed course. Not toward the Council, not toward Harlan, toward humanity's home. Director Kalen Voss felt the blood drain from his face as countless hostile formations accelerated together. For the first time since the war began, the enemy believed it finally understood humanity. And that belief was carrying the largest invasion fleet in history directly toward Earth. The news reached Earth before the enemy did. No alarm sounded. No cities erupted into panic. There were no emergency evacuations flooding orbital elevators, no desperate broadcasts urging civilians to flee, no government officials promising victory through carefully rehearsed speeches. Across humanity's homeworld, people simply continued what they had been doing. Children still walked into classrooms. Freighters still unloaded supplies above the Pacific orbital ring. Farmers still harvested beneath skies that had watched humanity survive thousands of years of its own mistakes. The calm unsettled the Council far more than panic ever could. Supreme Chancellor Varesh personally opened a secure quantum channel to Earth's High Defense Authority. You have less than 36 hours before the enemy reaches your system. A familiar voice answered. We know. You aren't evacuating. No. They found your homeworld. We expected them to. The Chancellor stared at the transmission in disbelief. Expected? There was a pause. Not hesitation. Almost sympathy. If they hadn't come eventually, the voice replied, our plan would have failed. The transmission ended before another question could be asked. For several long seconds, nobody inside the Council chamber moved. Director Kalen Voss slowly lowered his datapad. Every major revelation of the war replayed itself inside his mind. The shadow fleets, the abandoned infrastructure, the Harlan deception, the isolated battlefield, the impossible command vessel. None of it had ever been about protecting Earth. It had all been about convincing the enemy that Earth mattered more than anything else. The realization hit him with terrifying clarity. Humanity hadn't been defending their home. They had been baiting the galaxy's greatest predator toward it. 3 light years away, the enemy armada crossed into the Sol Corridor. Never before had so many warships occupied a single volume of space. Thousands upon thousands of vessels moved with terrifying synchronization around the colossal command intelligence at their center. For the first time since entering the galaxy, the invaders abandoned caution. Their advance accelerated. Scouts raced ahead. Strike groups expanded outward. Every tactical model predicted complete victory. Their enemy had finally become understandable. Every road led to Earth. Every surviving shadow fleet appeared to be converging there. The pattern was obvious. Destroy the homeworld. The war ends. Even the Council's most experienced admirals reluctantly agreed. It is the logical move. Director Voss whispered something no one else heard. That's exactly why it frightens me. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Isaac Mercer stood before a holographic projection of humanity's home system. Unlike the Council's tactical maps, his display contained no enemy icons, only probabilities, hundreds of them. Each represented a possible future generated by independent analytical teams spread across dozens of shadow fleets. No 2 predictions matched. Mercer preferred it that way. His executive officer approached quietly. Every fleet reports ready. Mercer nodded. The enemy? They've committed everything. No reserve formations? None. Mercer looked around the bridge. Every officer had gone strangely quiet. Not fearful. Focused. They all understood what came next. This was the point from which there would be no recovery if they failed. Mercer finally spoke. Signal every fleet. The communications officer hesitated. Which command package? Mercer smiled faintly. None. Confusion spread across several younger officers. No unified battle plans, sir. No. No synchronized formations. No. No central objectives. Mercer shook his head. Cancel every standing order. The bridge fell completely silent. Even veterans looked surprised. The communications officer blinked. Sir, you want us to remove command authority? Mercer's answer came without hesitation. Completely. Within seconds, encrypted transmissions spread across every surviving Shadow fleet. Council intelligence intercepted fragments. Then more. Then all of them. Director Voss stared at the decoded messages. He thought the translators had failed. Every fleet had received different instructions. Some were ordered to attack immediately. Others were instructed to avoid combat entirely. Several received no instructions whatsoever. Then, exactly 12 seconds later, every previous transmission was canceled. No replacements followed. The Shadow fleets had just erased their own chain of command. Across human space, admirals stopped waiting for permission. Captains stopped requesting authorization. Task force commanders stopped coordinating through centralized networks. Each fleet began making independent decisions based solely on local conditions. To every military observer in the galaxy, it looked like absolute collapse. Council officers watched in horror. They've lost command. Their communication network is broken. Their fleets are acting independently. Supreme Chancellor Varesh closed his eyes. So this is how humanity ends. Director Voss never answered. He was watching the enemy. At first, nothing happened. Then subtle irregularities appeared. The colossal command intelligence began issuing corrections faster than before. Enemy formations shifted again, then again. Some accelerated. Others slowed unexpectedly. Reconnaissance squadrons doubled back toward objectives they had already passed. For the first time, tiny disagreements appeared inside the perfectly synchronized invasion. The enemy's command intelligence was trying to predict humanity. But humanity was no longer behaving as one civilization. It was behaving as thousands of independent minds making thousands of independent decisions. No model could keep pace. Inside the enormous enemy command vessel, calculations multiplied beyond previously recorded limits. Probability trees expanded exponentially. Future simulations contradicted one another. Every new prediction became obsolete before it could be distributed. The intelligence attempted to simplify. Humanity changed again. It attempted categorization. The categories dissolved. It searched for patterns. Every pattern fragmented into smaller ones. Its greatest strength became its greatest burden, because a mind built to calculate everything could not stop calculating. Director Voss watched the recovered telemetry with growing amazement. It's overloaded. One analyst frowned. By what? Voss barely whispered the answer. Choice. Across the battlefield, something extraordinary began to happen. Enemy fleets started arriving at locations where human ships had already left. Others intercepted attacks that no longer existed. Several formations received contradictory orders from the colossal intelligence as new calculations continuously invalidated previous ones. The perfect machine had begun arguing with itself. Then every surviving Shadow fleet received one final transmission. Not from Earth, not from Admiral Mercer, not from any central authority. It contained only 5 words. Fight your own war now. Across millions of kilometers, thousands of human commanders smiled, because every one of them understood exactly what it meant. And somewhere inside the vast enemy command intelligence, for the first time since entering the galaxy, something astonishing happened. It hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds. For any biological commander, it would have been meaningless. For an intelligence capable of calculating trillions of outcomes every heartbeat, 2 seconds was an eternity. Across the invasion fleet, orders stopped arriving. Weapons that should have fired remained silent. Entire formations drifted without correction as commanders waited for instructions that never came. The perfect machine had encountered something it had never faced before. Not superior weapons, not superior numbers. An enemy that refused to become predictable. Admiral Isaac Mercer watched the tactical display with the calm expression of a man who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. His executive officer looked at the frozen enemy formations. It's happening. Mercer nodded. Not yet. The younger officers looked confused. Thousands of hostile vessels had stopped responding. Surely this was the moment to attack. Mercer simply folded his hands behind his back. If we strike now, they'll simplify. If they simplify, they recover. The bridge grew quiet again. Humanity had waited centuries. Another few moments would not matter, because the enemy was still doing exactly what Mercer needed. Thinking. Inside the colossal command intelligence, billions of predictive models expanded faster than they could be resolved. Every calculation reached the same impossible conclusion. Humanity possessed no stable doctrine, no universal command hierarchy, no permanent tactical philosophy. Every successful prediction immediately generated dozens of contradictory outcomes. Every attempt to reduce uncertainty produced even greater uncertainty. The intelligence searched its historical memory. Every civilization it had conquered shared common characteristics. Hierarchy, optimization, standardization, repeatability. Humanity possessed none of them. It searched deeper. Perhaps Earth had concealed a central intelligence directing the apparent chaos. No evidence. Perhaps independent fleets secretly followed identical algorithms. No evidence. Perhaps emotional irrationality explained the inconsistencies. No evidence. The calculations multiplied, contradicted, restarted, collapsed. For the first time since its creation countless millennia earlier, the intelligence could no longer distinguish between information and possibility. Its greatest weapon had never been firepower. It had always been certainty. And certainty was dying. Director Kalen Voss watched intercepted telemetry stream across his display. The data no longer resembled military communications. It resembled internal debate. Enemy command vessels questioned one another. Strike groups requested clarification. Reconnaissance fleets submitted conflicting reports. Entire formations paused while waiting for revised instructions that became obsolete before they arrived. The invaders had spent centuries defeating civilizations by breaking their ability to coordinate. Now, their own coordination was unraveling, not because humanity had destroyed it, because humanity had forced it to question itself. Voss leaned back slowly. They aren't losing a battle. One analyst looked toward him. Were they losing? Voss never looked away from the screen. Their confidence. Across human space, thousands of independent commanders reached exactly the same conclusion without speaking to one another. The hesitation had become instability. Instability had become opportunity. No universal signal ordered the attack. No flagship declared the beginning of the final engagement. One by one, human fleets simply acted. Fleet Atlas emerged from behind a shattered moon and struck isolated reconnaissance vessels before vanishing again. Fleet Echo, rebuilt inside hidden logistics corridors no enemy had discovered, severed communications between 3 invasion groups. Fleet Orion ignored the nearest targets completely, choosing instead to disable energy distribution across enemy support formations. Elsewhere, dozens of civilian transport captains, former engineers, exploration crews, and reserve officers who had never expected to fight joined nearby fleets on their own initiative. No one assigned them. No one organized them. Humanity did what it had always done during its darkest hours. People saw problems, then solved the ones standing directly in front of them. The enemy tried to respond. Every response generated new contradictions. Each isolated commander interpreted changing conditions differently. The colossal intelligence issued updated strategies thousands of times every second. Each update invalidated hundreds before it. Eventually, enemy formations stopped waiting. Individual commanders began making local decisions. For the first time, they resembled humanity, but they had learned the lesson far too late. Independent judgment could not be mastered in minutes. Humanity had spent thousands of years living with disagreement. Entire cultures have been built around questioning authority, challenging assumptions, arguing until better ideas emerged, and adapting faster than circumstances changed. What appeared chaotic from the outside had always been practice. The shadow fleets were merely the latest expression of an ancient habit. Hours later, the invasion ended without a final decisive explosion. One after another, enemy formations disengaged. Not because they lacked ships, not because they lacked weapons, because their command intelligence finally reached a conclusion. Victory required prediction. Humanity could not be predicted. The surviving armada turned away from Earth, then from the Council, then from the galaxy itself. No surrender was offered. No threats were made. The immense fleet simply disappeared into intergalactic darkness exactly as silently as it had arrived. Only after the last gravitational wake faded did anyone truly understand that the war was over. Several weeks later, representatives from every surviving civilization gathered once again inside the Galactic Council. The chamber looked very different. Empty seats marked worlds that no longer existed. Military uniforms had replaced ceremonial robes. The confidence that had once defined the council was gone. Supreme Chancellor Varesh rose slowly before the assembly. We owe humanity an explanation. Instead of politicians, Earth sent Admiral Isaac Mercer. He carried no medals, no ceremonial escort, only a small data tablet that remained untouched throughout the meeting. The Chancellor asked the question every civilization wanted answered. When did you begin preparing for this invasion? Mercer answered without hesitation. The day after the peace accord was signed. The chamber fell silent. You expected this enemy? No, we expected reality. Confused expressions spread throughout the delegates. Mercer continued, peace is one of civilization's greatest achievements. But history teaches a simple lesson. The universe never signs the same agreement. He paused, allowing the words to settle. So we never prepared for a specific enemy. We prepared to face whatever arrived. Director Kalen Voss finally spoke. So your greatest weapon wasn't the shadow fleets. Mercer smiled. No, it was our willingness to keep changing long after everyone else believed they had already found the perfect system. No one argued, because every surviving civilization had witnessed the truth. The invaders had been stronger, more advanced, more efficient. Yet efficiency alone could not overcome imagination. Perfect order had fallen before imperfect freedom. Months later, as the galaxy slowly rebuilt, the Council adopted an entirely new defense doctrine, not based on humanity's ships, nor its weapons, but on its philosophy. Encourage disagreement, reward adaptation. Never mistake today's success for tomorrow's certainty. And far beyond every celebration, beyond every monument raised to commemorate humanity's impossible victory, deep inside forgotten shipyards hidden among the stars, new shadow fleets were already taking shape. Not because another war had been foreseen, but because if one lesson had survived humanity's long history above all others, it was this. The moment your enemies finally understand how you fight, it's already time to become someone they have never seen before.